Good morning. Welcome back to Behind the Scenes for Planet Doug. It is Saturday, November 18th. As always, cup of coffee on the go. This is coffee number 2 for this morning. And as always, right out of the gate, I have technology on my mind. First thing is my laptop wouldn't start. That's actually not that uncommon. Quite often when you lift up the lid of your laptop and then it turns on, right? And quite often this one doesn't. And I think there's something wrong with the power management in the laptop. The battery itself doesn't hold a charge anymore, and then you have to plug in the adapter. Yeah, I have to have power, plugged into the wall in order for the laptop to run. But even when it's plugged in, sometimes it won't turn on. And then when it does turn on it flickers on, and then you can see it says something like 0.1% power. You can see for whatever reason the laptop isn't registering the main power. And for some reason, it's trying to draw power from the battery, and there's no power there, and then it just shuts down again. And then I don't know. So I just leave the power plugged in for a few minutes, close the lid, and then I don't know. You just sort of chant over it, try and summon some technology energy, the gods of technology to come down and just make it work. I don't know, give it a little shake or something, and then I'll turn it back on. By lifting the lid or pressing the power button, and then you just see what happens. And in this case, I got a warning that said the USB devices were drawing too much power. And I've had that from time to time. It's a message that doesn't make any sense to me because I don't have any USB devices plugged in. There's nothing. I have no hard drives, nothing. There's nothing plugged in through the USB ports, but it's telling me that my USB devices are drawing too much power. But it turns out what is often happening in those cases is that this adapter is malfunctioning. And this morning when I got the message about USB devices, I touched the adapter and it was red hot. It was like practically on fire. And this device is just used to plug in memory cards. It's got 2 USB-C ports, a couple of memory card slots, and then 2 USB-A slots. Because my MacBook doesn't have, it has 2 USB-C ports and that's it. And once you plug in the power into one of those ports, it leaves you one port only for everything else. And that isn't enough for me, so I use this adapter and plug it in, and when I touched it this time it was like red hot. So somehow there was a power failure inside this thing, and then my laptop was registering this as a USB device, saying that it was drawing too much power, even though nothing was plugged into it. But I guess there was some sort of a short circuit inside it or something, and the power was short circuiting and it was getting red hot. And anyway, that's why my laptop wouldn't turn on this morning. So I disconnected this and I plugged the power directly into the laptop. I left it plugged in for 5 or 10 minutes while I made a cup of coffee, and then my laptop turned on finally. So maybe this is now defective. I may have to get a new one, or just something weird happened this morning that won't happen again. I'll find out. So that was my first technology problem this morning. It was a bit of a shocker because, to be honest, every morning when I wake up, I do expect this laptop to just not turn on. And then I keep wondering, okay, what would I do in that case? It's like my life flows through this device, and then if you wake up one morning and it just doesn't work anymore, it's like, okay, now then what do you do? Of course, it wouldn't be a total emergency because I can get online with a smartphone. I can even edit video on a smartphone and upload videos on a smartphone. So it wouldn't be like the end of the world. I would just be going back to my previous life, because there was a time, a long time in Thailand when I had no laptop at all, and my entire life was run by smartphones. video editing, video uploading. I bought a portable keyboard, like a Bluetooth keyboard, and I plugged the keyboard into my phone, using a Bluetooth connection, and I would type emails, do all of my work on my phone. So it wouldn't be a total disaster, but it would take some adjusting now to go from a laptop back to my old smartphone life, and I don't want to do that at this point. And the other technology issue this morning was kind of a funny one. I talked the other day about how I didn't fix it, but the battery compartment door on my Olympus is broken. It won't stay closed. And what I started to do is just put an elastic band. When I put the camera away, like inside its case, I can't leave the door dangling open because it's going to snap right off. So I have to sort of close it. I can't lock it closed, but I can put it into place and then put an elastic band around the camera, and that holds the door. So then I can put it back in its camera bag and keep everything safe. But this morning I noticed that elastic band had slipped into the controls, because I've got the dials on the camera that adjust, aperture, shutter speed, and exposure compensation, things like that. And then as I was turning the dial, it was sucking the elastic band into the edge underneath the dial. It was getting jammed in there. And luckily I caught it in time that it didn't get sucked all the way in. I could reverse the dial and then pull the elastic band out. So I didn't do any permanent. It wasn't permanently stuck, but I think I have to rethink my elastic band system. I have to come up with something a little sturdier. As far as YouTube goes, my brain is still occupied with the Darien Gap. In my previous behind-the-scenes video, I talked a lot about the Darien Gap, all these documentaries I've been watching about it, and the videos from Bald and Bankrupt in particular, where Bald and Bankrupt has set off on a journey from Venezuela all the way to the border between Mexico and the United States. And he's doing this to recreate the journey of the migrants from South America, or I should say migrants from all around the world, because a lot of people from around the world are flying into South America, people from Afghanistan, from China, from Vietnam, from a lot of different countries, and then they are all making the journey along with South Americans. The largest group by far right now are the Venezuelans, and they're all walking to the north. But the very first major barrier they come across is the Darien Gap, and that is a section of jungle and mountains and rivers between Panama and Colombia. And that gap is called a gap because the Pan American Highway doesn't go over it. The Pan American Highway system stops at the gap in Panama. The road just ends, and then the road continues in Colombia, but with a 60, 70 kilometer gap. So there are no roads in that area. And there's been a recent change in visa policies in Mexico and Central America, where they're no longer, they've made it much, much stricter. So Venezuelans used to be able to get a tourist visa. They could fly into Mexico and then migrate from there to the US border, but Mexico closed that option and nobody can get visas anymore. It's much more difficult to do. So instead of flying into Mexico with a visa, now all of these migrants, the caminantes, are forced to walk from Venezuela into Colombia. Well, they take buses, I think, for most of that route. Most of them, if they have the money, they'll take a bus, and then they get to a town called Necloqui on the coast of Colombia, and then they take a boat across a big bay to these towns right on the edge of the Darien jungle, and then they hike through the Darien Gap to eventually arrive in Panama. And Bald he wanted to do that with them and then shoot video along the way. And I talked about that at length in my previous video. And in fact, I deleted quite a large portion of that video because it ended up being 3 hours long. And I deleted an hour-long section in which I was kind of critiquing Bald's video because I had some issues with it. The video itself, how he shot it, the things he said, and the things he did. And I kind of broke it down because I had a long list of issues. But yeah, it was over an hour long while I was doing that. And then by the end of it, I thought, like, why spend so much time on this topic? It's not worth all of this. So I just removed that whole section. But I still have all these thoughts, rumbling around in my brain. And I thought I would just go over those issues really quickly, just sort of the biggest ones that I came across. So sort of a wind-up or a wrap-up of Bald and Bankrupt's videos. I was hoping there was going to be a new one today. I was hoping he was going to post his next video in the series. But so far he's only posted 2 videos. The first one, he traveled from Venezuela to the town of Necoclí, or Necoclí? I think it's Necoclí in Colombia. That was video number 1. And then video number 2 was all about his crossing of the Darien Gap. And that's all he's posted so far. And he's traveling with another YouTuber, a guy from Greece called Timmy Carter. And so far, Timmy Carter has only posted 1 video about the journey through Colombia to Necoclí. And he hasn't posted his video about crossing the Darien Gap yet. I'm looking forward to that video a great deal because, as I said, I had some issues with Bald and Bankrupt's video. I want to see if Timmy Carter's video basically tells the same story, or maybe he provides more detail because Timmy Carter speaks Spanish quite well. And as they were going through the Darien Gap, as they were going through Necoclí, Capergana, and then hiking through the jungle, Bald mentioned quite a few times that Timmy, he could understand what people around him were saying. And because Timmy could understand people, he was quite a bit more nervous, scared, or paranoid about their situation because he could hear people talking about them because, Bald and Timmy, they stood out. They were clearly not Venezuelan migrants. So who are these guys? And they pretended to be Russians, though I don't think that really worked. He talked about how they can't speak English and they have to pretend to be Russian refugees or they could get in trouble. But I don't think they kept up that facade for very long. They spoke in English all the time and they were filming people clearly speaking in English, and they, British accent, and they both have video cameras, the Sony FDR X3000, and they're constantly taking video. So they clearly were not true migrants. So this whole idea of pretending to be Russian refugees, I don't think they really kept that up for very long. But anyway, the people in their group, because they were going through the jungle with a large number of other migrants, there's so many people crossing the Darien Gap now, as I talked about here in 2023, as many as 2,500 people per day set off on various routes through the jungle. There are different routes they can follow, but if you add up all of them together, it's about 2,500 migrants every day. And then they have guides for this journey, and they have to pay to cross the Darien Gap. They have to pay these guides, and they're all connected with the Gulf Cartel and various, criminal gangs and groups in the Darien Gap, and it's all pretty organized. But anyway, Bald and Timmy weren't like hiking through the jungle by themselves. They were in a big group of 100, 200 people, I'm not sure. And then there'd be other groups behind and ahead of them, so there's lots of people, going through the jungle. And then Timmy could hear the people, he could overhear their conversations talking about him and Bald, and it made him quite nervous. So I'm interested to hear what Timmy has to say about their journey. So let's try to do a quick run through of some of the issues I had, with his video, with Bald's video in particular. The first one I talked about in the other video. The main one is this idea that he's making kind of a YouTube stunt video about a serious situation, and I am wondering about the ethics of that, sort of heading off on, joining the migrants on this journey. And it's a very serious situation for the migrants, and yet Bald is doing it for a YouTube stunt, basically. He's not a journalist. He's not documenting the experiences of the other migrants. He's doing it for his own YouTube channel, and you have to wonder about that. And he does get, he veers into the area of sensationalism, talking about the difficulties for him, kind of a hero's journey for him, all of the dangers he's going to face, and makes a big meal out of it from that point of view. But at the beginning, he did talk about how he wanted to tell the stories of the migrants. And my problem with what he ended up doing was he didn't really tell the story of the other migrants at all. So at the very beginning, before he even reached the Darien Gap, he met up with groups of migrants, and he would talk to them, but he never really got any of their stories. There was one group in particular that were going to Chile. They were Venezuelans, but rather than going to Panama, they were actually going to go to Chile first. And I wanted Bald to ask them, well, about their situation. Why did you leave Venezuela? But more importantly, oh, you're going to Chile. Why? Like, why are you going to Chile instead of trying to go to the United States? Like, what's the strategy here? And also, how? Like, why are you going to Chile? And then, how are you going to Chile? Like, are you going to walk? Because these people were sleeping outside. Bald, traveled by bus, and he slept in, low-budget hotels every night and was just going to restaurants and buying his food. He was living the life of a normal backpacker, basically, traveling through Colombia. And these true migrants, the true caminantes, they were sleeping outside and probably going to walk to Chile. But we don't know because Bald didn't ask him. I wanted him to ask them, oh, you're going to Chile. Why are you going there? What do you hope to accomplish? Why is Chile a better place for migrants than Panama, the United States, Mexico, going to Ecuador, staying in Colombia? Like, what are your plans? And how are you going to go to Chile? I mean, if they're sleeping outside, kind of makes sense. They don't have enough money for buses and hotels, so they're probably going to walk all the way to Chile. And I wanted to hear their story. He also met a guy from Vietnam who was kind of part of his group, and this Vietnamese migrant spoke Russian, and I thought there'd be a very interesting story there. Why did you leave Vietnam? What, of course the Vietnamese guy wanted to go to the United States. That was his goal, but he chose to travel on the migrant route from South America. So, like, how does that work? How did you even know this was possible? How did he do it? Like, he had to buy a ticket. He had to fly from Vietnam to South America. Like, what country did he fly to? Could he get a visa for that country? What happened when he landed? And now he's on his way. Like, I wanted to know all of the logistical details about this guy from Vietnam. But Bald just said, oh, here's a guy from Vietnam, and that's it. He didn't ask for any details about his journey. And it was the same. I mean, there were people in his group, as he said, from Afghanistan. I'm sure there were people there from Haiti, and he didn't get the stories from any of those people. And I kind of had an issue with that. I don't really care about Bald's story. I know what his story is. He talks a lot about that, but I wanted to know what the story of these migrants were, and he didn't actually do any of that. And in general, I had an issue with the video from the point of view, like questions about the things Bald was saying. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was exaggerating the dangers, was kind of curating his story to sort of mislead the viewer. into seeing a lot of dangers and a lot of drama and wild, crazy things when maybe they didn't actually happen, and leaving a lot of information out. So just a few examples, I guess. He met these guys from Chile, and one of the guys had he was telling a story about being robbed. He was robbed. Men with machetes robbed him, and he had a scar on his arm that was, he got cut by one of the machetes. And then Bald didn't ask for any details, like when did this robbery take place, and where did it take place, and why. And Bald basically left you with the impression that this was an example of the dangers of the migrant trail, the caminantes, that, as he put it, he could be robbed and killed, he's risking his life. And yet none of that was true from the story, because, even the scar on the guy's arm was a very old one. It's perfectly healed. It's not like it happened yesterday because they're migrants walking to Chile. We don't know. So Bald told these sorts of stories and yet didn't give any context for them, and it felt like the idea was to just find anything around him that looked the least bit dangerous or crazy or wild, and then just sort of fold that into his story to make it more wild and crazy and more dangerous for him. A couple of quotes from Bald. When he was in Necoclí and kind of getting a tent and water and arranging a boat to take them over the harbor, over the bay, he was looking at the camera and he was pontificating about what was going to happen in the days ahead. And he says, do I want to die in the Darien? I mean, it's kind of a heroic death. It's just, I don't know, like I could die. He says to himself, do I want to die in the Darien? Not really, but, it would be a heroic death. A bit over the top, And then when he got on the other side of the Darien, they arrived at kind of a refugee processing center. And I'm quoting from the video, he said, well, after 5 days of walking through the world's deadliest jungle, avoiding kidnap, murder, deadly diseases, injury, death, there is a sight for sore eyes ahead of me. And that's just sort of the tone of most of the things that he says in the video, just constantly beating this drum about the dangers of death and injury and disease and kidnapping and murder. And yet in the actual journey itself, he didn't really encounter any of these things. There was one moment on the trail where they stopped. Everybody on the trail stopped, I guess. We don't actually see that. And he says, oh, there was a robbery. There's robbers ahead. So we're waiting. But then he never went up to talk to anybody. Like he said, there are robbers ahead. It's like, okay, but where are they? What did they do? Did people get robbed? I mean, if there are robbers, then something happened, find the people who were robbed and get their story. But there's just all these little hints about the dangers. And he was talking about on the trail, there were strips of blue plastic hanging from the trees and the bushes to mark the route they're supposed to follow. And he said about those bits of blue plastic, our lives depend on those blue bits of plastic. Our lives depend on these, because he was saying that we have to follow these, and sometimes they're missing. And then if we go in the wrong direction, we could die in the jungle, we could be murdered, all these dangers again. But again, I find that to be an exaggeration, because the trail is like a thoroughfare now. So many people a day, like thousands of people a day, walk along that trail. It's beaten into the land. It's very obvious where to go. And all these migrants, as he talked about endlessly, are dumping a lot of their gear because they're carrying a lot of heavy stuff, and then they want to get rid of the weight, so they're just dumping stuff at the side. And there are people ahead of him, people behind him. He's walking with a group of 100 to 200 people. He's in a big group, and he's just basically going where everybody else is going. And they have guides, And on the first day, they arrived at a camp, and he didn't show the camp or really talk about it much, but he says, oh, we've arrived at our first camp, and there's food and water here for us, and we're taking a rest. And I don't know. The reality of his experience didn't really match up with this constant beating of the drum about how they could die at any minute, on this trail. And I found he exaggerated a lot of that along the way. And I wondered if he was misleading as well. A good example of that is his first attempt to begin the journey. He took the boat from Nekokli to a town called Kapargana, and Kapargana is the most northern town or city of Colombia. And so he took a boat there, and he arranged for another boat to take him and Timmy with, he met a guide there, paid money, made arrangements for his trip through the Darien Gap, and that route is more of a sea route. If you have more money, that's the safer and easier way to go, and that's what he tried to do at first. And then he got in a boat, and then they took the boat up to Panama, and then the video smash cuts to them getting back on the boat and returning. And so, yeah, their first attempt completely failed. And Bald says that they started, they arrived on the coast, met up with their guide, and then they started walking through the jungle to begin the crossing of the Darien Gap. But then they ran into the Panamanian military, and then they were turned back. But as he describes it, he says, we were caught by the military in Panama, arrested, stuck in a prison cell, and kicked out of the country. So my question is, why is none of this on video? Because he doesn't show any of it. He says that they began their journey, they took the boat from Kapargana to the coast of Panama, got out of the boat, obviously, met up with their next guide. Interestingly, their guide was supposed to be a guy called Juan Lopez. He says, okay, just go there, look for a guy named Juan Lopez. And that made me laugh, because it's like, how many Juan Lopez's are in South and Central America? I think a lot of them. And yesterday at some point, I went back in time to rewatch the videos from Itchy Boots, because Itchy Boots did this journey with her motorcycle. But of course, she didn't do it as a migrant. She did it everything legally. She just had her motorcycle and had to hire boats to take her from Colombia to Panama. And she went to official ports and went through immigration and customs. So she did everything legally, and she did the whole thing by boat. But anyway, when she set all this up, her fixer, the guy who did everything for her, it was from Kapargana, a man who lives in Kapargana, and his name was Juan Carlos. So for Bald it was Juan Lopez, and for Itchy Boots it was Juan Carlos. So I just thought that was kind of funny. But anyway, Bald met up with his guide Juan Lopez when they arrived out the coast, and then they started hiking through the jungle, according to his story. And then they encountered the military, who arrested them, put them in prison, and then kicked them out of the country. But it seems to me that if this happened the way he described it, he would have at least a little bit of video of it. I mean, this is like the first day of his actual hike into the Darien Gap. And there's no way he wouldn't record something on video, but he doesn't have anything. He doesn't have, arriving at the coast, getting off the boat, meeting their guide, getting organized, paying the guide because he had to pay him money, and then hiking into the jungle, and then they got stopped by the military. Some of that would be on video, and yet none of it is. And then the way he describes being stuck in prison, like we were stuck in a prison cell, just makes it sound very dramatic, like they were arrested by the military and dragged kicking and screaming and put in prison and held in prison. And yet none of that really rings true for me, as I said, because he doesn't show the beginning of it on video. I could understand if, you know, they did run into soldiers who arrested them and put them in prison. That might be hard to get on video, because how do you film soldiers without annoying them deeply? And then they would not have their cameras with them while they're in prison. But again, you know, my sense is they basically took the boat to the coast, and then they landed at the dock, and then there were officials there, whether soldiers, immigration people, whatever, and then they said, you know, do you have a visa for Panama? And they said, no, we don't. And he says, okay, back you go. And then they got back in their boat and went back. You know, my sense is they did not get arrested by the military, and they were not put in a prison cell. It looks like they were just turned back at the border, and basically, you know, get back in your boat and go back the way you came. So, feels like he was misleading us there. Who knows? And I have the same concerns, the same questions about the journey itself, because when he arrived at the refugee camp, the processing center on the other side of the Darien jungle and the mountains, you know, he completed his walk. He kept saying over and over that he was in the jungle for 5 days. And yet, I don't see 5 days in his video. I see 2.5 days. I've watched the video 3 times now, and you kind of go through it very carefully, because it is an interesting video. I don't want to say, you know, with these criticisms, I don't want to say it's not an entertaining YouTube video. It is very entertaining, and it's well worth watching. But at the same time, you know, I watched it 3 times, and I enjoyed it each time. But he slept in his tent 2 nights on video, and he shows no other experiences. So day 1, they started hiking with his big group of people, and they actually crossed over the Panama-Colombia border on day 1. So day 1, you know, they went into the jungle, climbed up into the hills, went over the border, down the other side, and that's where they spent the first night, at the side of the river. And then he documents on video a second day of hiking and slept in the tent again. And then on the third day, they arrived at the camp on the other side. So no matter how I look at that video, I looked at it very carefully, I can only see 2.5 days, you know, in the jungle. 2 nights in the jungle, and that's it. So I don't know where 5 days comes from. And when he was in the processing center, you know, the refugee camp, there was one time he came up to this woman, Colombian or Venezuelan woman, I can't remember which, and she was doing laundry. In the camp they had, you know, showers and bathrooms and big tubs, cement things where running water where they could wash their clothes and stuff. And a woman was there washing all of her family's clothes, and she was a kind of a big, hefty sort of woman, and she clearly had come with her family, probably had children with her. And Bald talked to her and asked her, oh, how long did it take you? And she said 4 days. So again, I was thinking, well, if it took her 4 days, then how in the world could it have taken Bald and Bankrupt 5 days, right? I don't know. Everything in the video made it seem like he did the journey in 2.5 days. When he was talking about the water that they had with them, the amount of food that they had with them, and just the overall conditions and the hiking. You know, 2 nights in a tent. He only showed 2 nights. Feels like if there were 4 nights in a tent, because his story is double that he would have spent 4 nights in the jungle and arrived at the refugee camp on the 5th day. That would come across in the video, I think. It would feel different if he spent 4 full days hiking through the jungle, 4 nights sleeping in the jungle, and then on the 5th day, another 5th day of hiking, and then arriving at, I mean, that's a whole different ball game from what he showed in the video. So it just makes me suspect. I just have questions about his video, whether he's, really giving accurate facts about what happened and what he really did on this journey. And you can see that in the tone of everything. It's typical, YouTube exaggeration, endless superlatives about how difficult and dangerous everything is. And, talking about how I'm going to die a hero's death in the jungle. And I don't know why he would view this as someone being a hero. He wasn't helping anyone. He wasn't doing anything. He was just shooting a YouTube stunt video. There's nothing particularly heroic about that. And the title of his second video, I think he changed it at one point. I think it had a different title at the beginning, but then he changed it to I was trafficked through the world's deadliest jungle, something like that. But he uses I was trafficked, which of course is a very crazy, wild and sensational way of phrasing it. But no, he wasn't trafficked. When people, human smuggling, human trafficking, that involves kidnapping people against their will and then taking them around the world and putting them to work so that you can profit from them. It's been, human trafficking. So for him to say I was trafficked, again, is a very sensationalistic title, implying that he was kidnapped and then held for ransom or taken around the world and held prisoner and put to work. That's trafficking. He basically just entered Panama illegally, hiked through the Darien Gap along with the other migrants. He was not trafficked by anyone. And then you get other little bits and pieces throughout the video. At one point, he over and over, he talks about how dangerous this is going to be. He keeps talking about that constantly. And then he says, I am the first, how did he put it exactly? Yeah, he says, quoting, "This is the first time anyone has done this." And then there's a pause from YouTube. So, he wanted to say, this is the first time anyone has done this. But even he can't make that claim because reporters from around the world have done this. Journalists from CNN, from NBC, from all the big worldwide news organizations, from Al Jazeera, have all done this hike with the migrants. This has been done multiple times by big, organizations. So he's far from the first person to have done this. And he's not really the first one from YouTube either, because all of these videos from Al Jazeera and CNN and ABC News and name, half a dozen others, they're all on YouTube as well. They're all YouTube videos. So again, he keeps trying to imply, he's just trying to exaggerate just how extraordinary this thing is that he's done. And I just ended up with questions about that. After doing such a deep dive into Bald and Bankrupt's Darien Gap videos, I decided to go back and rewatch the videos from Itchy Boots. As I mentioned, she also did, she didn't go through the Darien Gap because on a motorcycle, that is completely insane. There's a YouTube documentary about it. It was a group of guys from the US, ex-military, and they decided to ride motorbikes all the way from North America down to South America. And they wanted to do the whole thing overland, so they did take their motorcycles overland through the Darien Gap. And it's quite something to see. They rode all the way to the end of the road. What's the name of the town at the end of the road there? I should know what it is. Yaviza. Yeah, Yaviza. is the last city in Panama, and the road ends at Yaviza. So they rode their motorbikes there, and then they made an arrangement with a local guide to get their motorcycles through the jungle most of the distance by boat on rivers. But there were sections where there were no rivers, and they had to push their motorbikes on jungle trails, up and over hills on these jungle trails. And they had whatever, 10, 15 local people helping them, because there's no way, you couldn't do it by yourself. You'd need, 10 people pulling on ropes and pushing from behind just to get the motorcycles, through the jungle. And they said they paid the guy $10,000 for the trip. So that was like a flat fee, 10,000 US, to get them. I think there were 3 of them, 3 guys and 3 motorcycles through the Darien Gap. And it's pretty insane. Makes no sense to do it, to be honest. It's sort of like, I don't know, you go to the Sahara Desert and you want to be the first person to cross the Sahara Desert in a Volkswagen Beetle. I mean, you'd have to hire 100 people to pull your car across the Sahara, and you can be the first person ever to do it. But what is the point? Like motorcycles like that are not designed to go through steep jungle hills, muddy trails. It's just not what they're made for. And Itchy Boots obviously was not going to try to do anything like that. And she just went around the Darien Gap by boat from Colombia to Panama by boat, and then she could eventually get to a point where there's a road, and then she could continue, and that's what she did. And now that I've done such a deep dive into Bald and Bankrupt, and I watched all these other documentaries from CNN and from Al Jazeera and Real Life Lore. I want to talk about the Real Life Lore video in a minute. I had so much information in my head now about the geography of this region. I wanted to go back and watch Itchy Boots' video again, and then I'll be able to understand her journey quite a bit better. So what I'm going to do is fire up Google Maps and turn on screen recorder on my laptop, and then just sort of go over what she did, which I find quite interesting now that I have a lot more information about it. Okay, let's start with this view just to get context, because of course this is South America down here, North America up there, and then Central America here, separating them. And there's Colombia and Panama, and then the Darien Gap is right here. So if we zoom in closer, you can see this line here is the border between Colombia and Panama, and there you can see this yellow line. So that's the Pan American Highway, highway number 1, I guess, and it ends right here, and that should be Yaviza. So that's where the road ends. And then, as far as I understand the history, the official Pan American Highway begins again at Turbo here in Colombia. So the original plan for the Pan American Highway was to go from Yaviza and then somehow over the hills here through the jungle of the Darien and then around the bay to Turbo. And then from Turbo, the Pan American Highway would continue south. So the fact that there is a gap in the highway, there's a gap between Yaviza and Turbo, that's why it's called the Darien Gap, because there is a gap in the Pan American Highway here. So when Itchy Boots, of course she was riding her motorcycle from the south all the way to the north, so she was on her way to this area, riding through Colombia, starting in Medellin, I think. And then her original plan was to take a kind of cargo boat from Turbo. And she doesn't give a lot of logistics, but from what I understand, she went online looking for information, as we all do, and she eventually connected with some people in this town, Capergana. And this family there runs a guest house in Capergana, and they also act as guides helping foreigners, get over the Darien Gap. And somehow or other, she ended up connected with this guy. His name is Juan Carlos. And the original idea was to meet up with Juan Carlos in Turbo, and then she was going to put her motorcycle on a cargo ship, and the cargo ship was probably going to take her to Colón, the first major city in Panama, deliver her motorcycle there, and then she was going to make the journey maybe by speedboat. And so she was going to travel separate from her motorcycle. And then they were going to meet up again in Colón. So that was the first idea. But then when she got to Turbo and met up with Juan Carlos, I guess they looked into this option, but it wasn't possible. For whatever reason, they weren't able to do it. So then they changed their plan, and their new plan was to do something very similar to what all the migrants do, which is to go to the town of Necoclí, and then from there get a boat across this bay to Capargana, this town here, and then from here get another boat and then continue up the coast of Panama. So that's ultimately what she did. She spent some time in Turbo because she had to get customs clearance for her motorcycle, and that was very difficult to do, and she struggled a lot with that. But she eventually got something done. She got some papers that may help her, get through customs. And then once all that was done, she rode her motorbike to Necoclí. And then in Necoclí, she hopped on this boat with Juan Carlos to take her and her motorcycle to Capargana. And that was kind of interesting because I'm not sure exactly when she did this, but it would have been back in 2020 or 2021, maybe 2020. But I don't think the migrants were as prevalent back then. Like now in 2023, they expect 500,000, like 500,000 migrants to make this journey from Necoclí to the coast and then go through the Darien Gap. 500,000 of them. So if you went to Necoclí now, then you went down to the harbor area, down to the docks, you'd see hundreds, if not thousands, of migrants trying to make the journey. But when Itchy Boots was there was almost nobody. It was like she was there all by herself. So the whole journey seemed a lot easier back then than it would be now. And then when she took the boat to Capargana, again, when she landed at Capargana, it seemed very laid back, like nobody else was there. But of course, if you do that journey now, you'd be landing at a very different place, full of migrants trying to get into Panama. From a personal point of view, I'm always surprised at how fast people move. I kind of admire it. I admire the mental and physical stamina to do the things, that someone like Itchy Boots does. But at the same time, it's not anything I would ever want to do. So, for example, when she did this boat ride from Necoclí to Capargana, she did it all in one day. So basically, she woke up in Turbo, packed up her motorcycle, got everything ready, then rode her motorcycle all the way to Necoclí, and then she went straight to the docks, put her motorcycle on the boat, and then went to Capargana, and there she spent one night in Capargana, and then the very next morning got on the boat to take her into Panama. And I could never do that for two reasons. I'm just not tough enough, and also because I would find it interesting to hang out in a place like Necoclí. So if I go to all the trouble to ride a motorbike from Turbo to Necoclí, and then I have plans to take a boat from Necoclí to there, it would be such a big event in my life. I would want to savor it. I would spend at least 2 nights and 1 full day in Necoclí, because I would need that time to rest up, to get organized, to think about what the journey is all about, and to really just enjoy it. And to be honest, with a town like Necoclí, I would probably spend a week there just hanging out, going to the docks, looking at all the boats and just experiencing life there. So it would take me a week to get out of Nekokli and Itchy Boots. She didn't even spend one night there. She rode in on her motorbike, went straight to the dock, got on the boat and left, and then went all the way to Capragana. A big long day to get there. Had to clean up her motorbike, get all the salt water off of it, and then repack and get ready. And then the very next morning at the crack of dawn, back to the dock, put her motorbike on another boat, and then make the journey into Panama. And again, I would spend a week in Nekokli, and I'd probably spend a week in Capragana just hanging out. So it's, it always amazes me how fast people can travel and how they can do it mentally and physically. But anyway, so that's how her journey went, Nekokli, Capragana. And then when she was there, she took a boat that took her from Capragana, this town, around this peninsula to here, the town of Puerto Obaldia. Puerto Obaldia. So her first boat took her here, and this is an official entry point into Panama, and there's an immigration office there. So this is where she went to immigration, and she got her visa for Panama, got stamped into the country. And of course she had all the, she had a valid passport and customs documents for her motorcycle. She was doing everything legally. And of course, bald and bankrupt and all the migrants, they're doing it illegally, so they couldn't go to a place like that. They're not going to go through immigration. So I think this is where Bald went, to be honest. I don't know that for sure because Bald never says where he went, but it kind of makes sense that his first attempt, the failed attempt from Capragana, I think he took a boat around. It was a very short journey, and I think he went here, and then that's where they were sent back. They were not allowed to continue from this point. And there's actually a little snippet in his video that shows Timmy Carter coming out of an immigration office. So that's what makes me think he had to come here, because they had to go through an immigration office as they were being, deported from Panama. And I think if he went to, one of these other towns up here, they wouldn't have an immigration office. So anyway, I don't really know. But anyway, I do know about Itchy Boots because she gives the names of the places where she went and gives all the details. She gives a lot more logistical information than Bald did. So she got another boat from here to Puerto Olbaldia, and I don't think she spent the night here. She just went to immigration, got a visa stamp, and got back in the boat, and then the boat continued up the coast, and I believe she went all the way to here, which is an island called Naragana. There's actually 2 islands here, Naragana and then another one, and they're really, really interesting islands. Let me put on satellite view. You can see what they look like. So these are the 2 islands, and they're connected by a bridge. That looks insane. That looks crazy. So this is the first place in Panama where Itchy Boots spent the night. Her original plan was to go all the way to another spot, but they couldn't make it in time. They didn't have enough time to make the trip, so they stopped here to spend the night here. And again, if I was in a place like this, I mean, I don't even know why I would even think about going anywhere else. I mean, it looks so interesting. Looks like is that an airport? Like a very small airstrip maybe? And all these harbors, these little docks along the water. Looks like an amazing place. I could probably spend a month there, just hanging out, going back and forth across this bridge. That must look amazing. I wonder if we can get some street view here. No street view. But anyway, just to zoom out again and go back to a regular view. So what Itchy Boots did was Nekokli to Capragana, spend one night in Capragana. Then she went around to Obaldía, got her visa stamp, and then rode in a boat all the way up the coast to Nargana, spent the night in Norgana, and then I believe she went to around here, which is where the road begins. Like right here, you can see there's a white line. So that's where the very first road appears. So I think she took the boat all the way to here and then got dropped off here and then had to ride her motorcycle all the way to Colon. And there in Colon, she went through customs. And then she could continue her journey to Panama City and then continue up the coast. But of course, she was doing everything legally. And all the migrants would have been doing this illegally. Watching all these YouTube videos and documentaries about the Darien Gap constantly brings up the question of course, why is there a gap? And you start coming across all this questioning and ideas about why there are no roads going through the Darien Gap. And it's a very interesting topic, actually, and for my money, it does have a very simple and obvious answer, and it may not be the answer that a lot of people think. And one good video about this topic that I found is from Real Life Lore, and the video is called "Why the Americas Still Aren't Connected by a Road." And from my point of view, I think they basically get it right. I mean, if you're just reading articles in general about the Darien Gap, they often talk about what a difficult geography it has, the rivers and the mountains and the jungles, and how building a road system there would be incredibly expensive and very difficult and have a lot of challenges in terms of the health of the workers because they're in a jungle environment. They're at risk of getting all kinds of diseases from ticks and mosquitoes and deadly snakes and spiders, things like that. People also talk about the environment there being quite fragile, the fact that it is quite untouched. In a way, it's like a virgin jungle area with all kinds of native species. And if you build a road system through there, you're going to be damaging the local environment and the animal ecosystems, things like that. So whenever there's an attempt to build a road, environmental groups would put up barriers. So you get that discussion. There are also indigenous peoples that still live in that area. And then you have the whole question of how do you build a road system through land owned by the indigenous communities? What happens to them and their lifestyles? So people put all of that into one big pot and say that's why there is no road going through the Darien Gap. It's too dangerous, it's too expensive. There's questions of indigenous groups, wildlife, and ecosystems. And that is all true. And you see a lot of discussion around that, but I think when you go a little bit, dig a little bit deeper or expand your perspective, I think you would come to the natural conclusion that there is no road across the Darien Gap because Panama and the United States don't want a road. They could build one. Technically, and from an engineering point of view, from an environmental perspective, I think all of those difficulties can be overcome, but politically, those barriers are stronger. The United States doesn't want a road, and Panama doesn't want a road. Why? Well, the obvious and the biggest reason is the Panama Canal. I mean, the Panama Canal is essential to the security of the United States, the economy, trade, and security. Massive ships can make it through the Panama Canal, so very important to the economy, and of course the U.S. military, the Navy, can go back and forth through the Panama Canal and defend both sides of the United States in the Atlantic and the Pacific. So the Panama Canal is essential to the economy and the security of the United States, and they like it that that canal is cut off from Colombia and from the rest of South America. What a lot of people don't realize is that Panama used to be part of Colombia. Colombia extended all the way up through the Darien Gap and included the land that is now Panama. That was all part of Colombia, right up until, I think, 1903. In 1903, Panama, with the help of the United States, declared independence from Colombia, and Colombia really couldn't do anything about it because of the Darien Gap. You know, Colombia could have used its armed forces to defeat the independence movement in Panama, but they can't move through the Darien jungle, so the only way they could defeat the independence movement in Panama would be by sea. And then the U.S., of course, sent their Navy down and said, you're not going to do that. So with the help of the United States, Panama declared independence from Colombia, and the U.S. did that, of course, because of the Panama Canal that they were involved in constructing. So that's the main reason. There is no road through the Darien Gap because the U.S. is protecting the security of the Panama Canal. And of course, if there was a road that goes right through the Darien Gap, that would open up a potential flood of migrant traffic. Like right now, the Darien Gap is serving as a major barrier for the people, so that the people of South America can't just flood up into North America and the United States. They like it that way, plus drug smuggling. If there was a road system going through the Darien Gap, of course, that would make it far easier for cocaine, for the drug smuggling, weapon smuggling, human trafficking, any kind of smuggling pouring up from South America, up into Mexico, up into North America. So the United States is very happy. They sleep, the leaders of the United States, in my opinion, they sleep much better at night knowing that there is a physical barrier between South America and North America. So the existence of Central America and the Darien Gap suits their interests from a security point of view, military point of view, and an economic point of view. You often think, just off the top of your head, you're thinking, wow, North America, South America, two huge continents. You would think it would be in their economic interest to build a road, connect the two, and then you get all that trade flowing back and forth across this road system. But when you think about it from the point of view of the Panama Canal and then the physical barrier for migration and drug smuggling, then, as I said, I think United States and Canada are very happy that the Darien Gap exists, and they're just going to keep it that way. And if there's any attempt to build a road across it, they are sure to raise all the other concerns. They're going to block it from the point of view of, environmental concerns, not damaging the ecosystem, and what about the indigenous people? And they will use those arguments to block any kind of road building effort, but their true motivation would have more to do with military concerns and security and economics and illegal trade, things like that. So, yeah, if you want to hear about that in more detail, I recommend this video from a real life lore. As I said, it's called Why the Americas Still Aren't Connected by a Road. And the things that they say in that video ring true for me as to why the Darien Gap still exists and why it's going to exist for a long time to come. A couple of new TV shows has entered the Planet Doug pop culture universe. The first one, and the one that I'm most excited about, is called Beacon 23. It's a brand new show, American show, science fiction, space show, and it just started up, season number 1, and I believe they've released 2 episodes so far. And they are part of an 8-episode season, but I think episodes 1 and 2 were sort of a two-parter of the premiere, the pilot episode, in a way, of Beacon 23. And the title comes from the fact that it's all taking place in kind of a space station, almost like a lighthouse in space. Like here on Earth, we have a lighthouse along the ocean to warn ships about dangers and how to navigate. And Beacon 23 is a lighthouse in space. And it has, just as how a lighthouse on Earth has a lighthouse keeper, a man or woman, someone who lives in the lighthouse all by themselves and maintains the lighthouse. Beacon 23 has a lighthouse keeper, a beacon keeper. And then the entire story so far is, that I can see, is going to be set inside and in Beacon 23 and in the immediate surroundings. So there's a deep mystery unfolding about what is happening at Beacon 23. And it stars Lena Headey, who I'm a big admirer of Lena Headey. I see her name in a show, I'm clicking, as they say. I see Lena Headey, I click. She played Mama in the movie Dread. So she was the leader of the criminal gang that was in charge of the big tower, the apartment block tower in Dread. And I think that was where I first became aware of her, was as Mama. And that character impressed me so much, and I tracked down the actress's name, Lena Headey. And she's one of those actors that is so different from the characters she plays. And that's what always amazes me. I see an interview with Lena Headey, and she looks really shy. She looks unsure of herself. She looks like an introvert, like she's really not that comfortable being interviewed. And then the characters she plays are completely different. She totally inhabits the character of Mama, tough, brutal gang leader, and so different from who she is as a human being. And of course, everybody knows her as Queen Cersei from Game of Thrones. So Lena Headey is also Cersei. And of course, that is a completely different character from her personality in real life. So I find her to be a real chameleon. She can play very different people from who she is in real life. And not all actors have that skill. I'd say that very few of them do. So she really stands out for me. So she's starring in it, as well as a man that I'm not familiar with, an actor named Stephen James. So he is, it's co-starring Lena Headey and Stephen James. And it was based on a series of short stories by Hugh Howey. And I didn't know any of that. I only know that because I looked it up, of course. But yeah, Beacon 23, I'm enjoying it quite a bit. And it also features AIs, which is really interesting. The Beacon 23, the entire lighthouse, the space station, is run by an AI, which I find really fascinating. And Lena Headey's character, I think her character's name is Aster. Aster has her own personal AI. And this AI lives in like a puck, a little electronic device, goes with her everywhere. And then her AI can access the systems of the lighthouse, of the beacon, and then project a hologram. And I find that very fascinating, that AIs in this world are not just built into big computer systems. People have their own personal AI that lives in a little device, kind of like having a smartphone that is your own personal AI, and it can project a hologram, and that AI talks to you and helps you out and goes with you everywhere you go. And I haven't gotten far enough in the show to know how unusual that is, but I'm guessing that only the super rich and very powerful have enough resources to have their own AI. So the fact that Lena Headey's character, Aster, has her own personal AI, makes me think that her work is very important, that she has friends in powerful places that provide her with an AI, and the average person just can't afford it, right? So anyway, I'm looking forward to learning more about this world, about the technology of this world, and I'm, of course, wanting to know a lot more about the mystery of what's going on. There's some mining going on, some smuggling going on, some new technologies appearing, and there's a lot of powerful players in the background. So the show opens without any preamble, just throws you like right into the middle of this big mystery. All kinds of things have already happened, and as a viewer, you're thrown right into the middle of it. And it's like, whoa, all these crazy things start happening. And now as the show progresses, I think you're going to learn a lot more of the backstory leading up to where the show begins. And yeah, I enjoyed it very much. Yeah, I think it's got a lot of things in it that interest me. The technology, space, science fiction, the AIs, and the characters themselves are very, very strong. And then it has the thriller aspect to it as well, the mystery. And you have to, eventually figure out what it is that's happening. It reminds me a little bit of The Expanse, though the scale of the story so far is nowhere near as big as The Expanse. I mean, The Expanse is on a geopolitical scale encompassing the entire solar system, and so far Beacon 23 isn't on that level. It's all taking place in one lighthouse in space, and so it's different from that point of view. But in terms of the technology we're seeing, the weaponry that we're seeing, it reminds me a little bit of The Expanse, and that's a good thing. The other show that is now on my radar is the new season 4 of For All Mankind. And there's only been one episode released so far, and I've already watched that one episode. It was quite good. A slow burn, of course, because it is the first episode of the season, and they have to establish the characters all over again. It's a very complicated set of characters, and they have very complicated histories. To be honest, they could have had an entire episode of just recapping who is who and who they are now and how they ended up where they are now. It's a very complicated story, and to be honest, even I was a little bit lost, because normally with a show like this, if I'm starting season 4 fresh, I might even go back and watch all of season 3 just so I know what's going on when I start season 4. And if I don't do that, I'll at least watch a recap, because there's all these videos where they'll tell you, they'll recap all of season 3 in a short form, so that brings you up to speed, and then you're like, okay, you're not so lost when season 4 begins. And I didn't do that for some reason. I'll probably do that today, to be honest, because even though I've watched episode 1 of season 4, and I'm up to speed, I kind of know who's who, and I know what's going on. They put all the balls in motion in terms of all the characters, but at the same time, I'm not quite as sure of my ground as I'd like to be. So I feel like I need a recap. I need a review of season 3, if not a review of seasons 1, 2, and 3 before I start season 4. Because it's not complicated only because of the characters being in space and their overall situation. It's complicated more than that because of the structure of the story. Because the whole story as a whole, like the TV show as a whole, For All Mankind, is based on an alternate history. So normally science fiction, where we have colonies on the moon, spaceships going to Mars, Beacon 23, where they've spread out over the entire galaxy perhaps, all of this is happening far in the future. But For All Mankind took a completely different approach. So in fact, season 4 of For All Mankind is taking place before now. Like, it's actually before 2023, because what they've done is they're retelling the history of Earth, but assuming that the Soviet Union landed the first people on the moon. So like in the history we have now, of course, the Americans won the space race. They were the first to put people on the moon, to land a spaceship on the moon. The Americans were the first to walk on the surface of the moon. And then the Soviet Union ultimately fell apart. Their whole system fell apart. But in this alternate reality, the Russians, the Soviet Union, were the first to land on the moon. They beat the Americans in the space race, and they didn't lose, they didn't fall apart to the extent that they did in our world. So they've recreated, they're basically going through the history of the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and 90s, but it's an alternate reality. They're rewriting history of the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s, but from the point of view of the ongoing space race. So that makes it even more complicated, because they introduce all kinds of things that we know, the presidents of the United States that we know, the political situation in the Soviet Union and Russia, pop culture, like movies, big movies that come out, music that comes out from the 60s to the 90s, all of that is the same, but the politics is different. So yeah, it's hard to keep track of sometimes. You feel like you're in a very familiar world. It's like, oh, the 80s. I know the 80s. I know the movies and the music and the politics of the 80s. So you feel like you know what's happening. But layered on top of that is a completely new reality. So I find that quite interesting. But it does make it hard to kind of keep your head in the right space for understanding, what is going on. And one thing I like about it is that because the show has been taking place back in whatever 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, it is all pre-internet, pre-smartphones, pre-social media, pre-AI, pre-all of that stuff. And it's kind of refreshing. It's almost like it's relaxing. It's like, oh, thank goodness. Because life can slow down. Information doesn't flow as fast as it does for us today. And if you're writing a script for a TV show or a movie that happens in modern times, of course, you have to account for smartphones. So it's much more complicated to write a script because all the characters in your show are in instant communication all the time. And that really affects how you tell a story, right? And in For All Mankind, we have this kind of a modern story about the space race, colonies on the moon and things like that, but nobody has a smartphone. So if you want to connect with someone, you have to phone them on a landline. You have to go to your house, you have to go to the office, and you've got to pick up a phone and dial a phone number. And the only way you can get in touch with this other person is if they are physically sitting or standing near their phone and they hear the phone ring and they pick up the phone. Hello? That's how people are communicating. And it seems so quaint and so old-fashioned now. And yet it's kind of nice. It's sort of like, oh, thank goodness, we don't have the pressures of this smartphone, like glued to our head 24 hours a day anymore. We don't have, back in those days, you didn't have instant access to everybody. Life could slow down a little bit. And I like that aspect to For All Mankind, the fact that the internet doesn't really exist yet, and smartphones don't exist, and instant messages don't exist, and FaceTiming doesn't exist yet. I kind of like that. It's like a comforting world to revisit for me. I kind of like that. This might be a new section I wanted to add to behind the scenes, because I find I often have like super random thoughts and I don't know what to do with them. And the one that's on my mind right now has to do with homemade or commercial zip lines, because for whatever reason, I enjoy YouTube videos about fails, like fails of the week, Fail Army. We all know Fail Army. They put together a 10-minute video of all these people on their skateboards crashing and, accidentally dropping things, breaking things, things bursting into flames, all the accidents of daily life, going out on your steps after an ice storm and zoom, slipping, and, all these things. I enjoy them. Kind of a pleasure of mine. But in these videos, they often have people going down a zip line, right? In their backyard, they have their own zip line, and they're racing down the zip line, and they get to the end of the zip line, and then their pulley system on the cable hits a barrier, bang, and then the person just stops dead. Like they're zooming along, the zip line hits the end, and the person just goes flying up into the air and crashes on their head. And this happens all the time. Every single zip line journey ends with a crash because the pulley system hits a block, and then that person flies in the air and crashes onto their head and nearly kills themselves. And I don't understand this, because why would you build something like this? Like, I assume this is an accident. It's something that's not supposed to happen. And yet, from what I can tell, there's no other way to stop. That is how a zip line is built. You've got a cable going downhill, and at the end of it, there's an abrupt stop. When your pulley system hits the block, you fly in the air and you crash. And every single zip line journey seems to end that way. And I'm wondering, that can't be right. Like, I've never seen, I don't think, one of these backyard zip lines, but I assume you're supposed to come to the end of your zip line and then gradually come to a stop. There's no way it was designed for you to crash every single time, but I can't see anything in the mechanism about how you could end your zipline journey in any other way. So I need someone to explain that to me. Why is it that every time I see someone on a zipline, they crash? What is supposed to happen? I assume something else is supposed to happen. You're supposed to come to a stop gradually or gently. You're supposed to slow down at the end, but there's nothing in the zipline mechanism that I can see that would ever slow you down. How are you supposed to slow down and stop on a zipline without crashing? I need somebody to explain that to me. So that is my super random thought for the day. And with that, I'm going to shut down my behind-the-scenes journal for this morning, all the thoughts that are in my head. I'm going to shut down, start my day. It's actually a little bit later in the day, so it's actually lunchtime. I'm going to go get some lunch. So I'm going to turn off my camera, and as always, I'll see you in the next video.